The labyrinth was not a myth. The ancient Greeks told a story about a king of Crete named Minos who kept a monster at the center of an enormous maze, a labyrinth so complex that once entered it could not be escaped without divine assistance. The story was understood as myth, as the kind of elaborate narrative that ancient cultures produced to explain things they did not understand. But when the British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating a mound on the northern coast of Crete in 1900, what he found beneath the soil was a palace of such complexity, with its corridors and staircases and magazines and courts arranged in a spatial logic so intricate that the myth and the archaeology suddenly seemed to illuminate each other in an unexpected way. The Palace of Knossos is not a labyrinth in the precise architectural sense, but it is a building of extraordinary complexity, a structure of perhaps 1,500 rooms arranged across multiple levels and organized around a central court in a plan that takes considerable effort to understand even with the benefit of a complete architectural map. To approach it from the outside without prior knowledge of its plan would be to enter a world of narrow corridors, sudden changes of level, storage magazines opening off labyrinthine passages, staterooms of considerable elegance opening without warning from apparently functional spaces, and everywhere the painted plaster of the frescoes, the dolphins and the athletes and the lilies and the bull-leaping scenes that made the Palace of Knossos one of the most vividly decorated buildings of the ancient world. The civilization that built Knossos and the other great palaces of Crete is called Minoan, after the legendary king Minos. The Minoan civilization that Evans's excavation revealed was not simply old in the sense of predating the well-known civilizations of Greece and Rome. It was old in a specific way, older than classical Greece by more than 1,000 years, contemporary with the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia at their height. The Greeks who later told the stories about Crete were telling stories about a world that had ended before their own civilization began, and the specific gap between the historical Minoan civilization and the mythological memory of it is one of the more interesting problems in the relationship between ancient history and ancient storytelling. The name was Arthur Evans's invention, a deliberate reference to the Greek myth, and it has stuck even though the Minoans themselves did not call themselves by this name, and even though the relationship between the mythological Minos and the historical civilization that Evans was excavating is not direct or simple. The Minoans were not the people of a myth. They were the people of a specific island in the eastern Mediterranean, building specific buildings and painting specific images and conducting specific commercial relationships across a specific historical period. And the myth that attached itself to their ruins was the later memory of a civilization that the ancient Greeks who told the story did not fully understand. Tonight we go to Crete, to the palaces and the painted rooms and the harbors and the mountain sanctuaries of the Minoan world, and we ask who these people were and what they built and why their civilization ended the way it did. The Minoans occupy a specific position in the history of European civilization that is both foundational and poorly understood. The conventional account of European cultural origins begins with Greece, with the philosophy, the democracy, the mathematics, the literature, and the art of the classical Greek world. Behind classical Greece lies the earlier world of the Mycenaeans, the palace civilization of mainland Greece that the Greek tradition remembered dimly in the epics of Homer. And behind the Mycenaeans, older and stranger and in many ways more sophisticated, lies the Minoan civilization of Crete, the first literate culture of the Aegean, the first palace civilization of Europe, the first maritime commercial empire of the ancient world west of the Levantine coast. The Minoan civilization developed on Crete from roughly 3000 BCE onward, reaching its peak of elaborateness and influence between approximately 2014-50 BCE. The specific timeline of the Minoan world is divided by archaeologists into a sequence of periods based on changes in pottery styles and in the character of the architectural and administrative evidence. The Proto-Palatial period, associated with the first palaces around 2000 BCE, the Neo-Palatial period following the earthquake destructions and rebuilding around 1700 BCE, and the final palatial period of Mycenaean influence at Knossos after 1450 BCE represent the major phases of a civilization that evolved significantly across its millennium of existence. reaching its peak of elaborateness and influence between approximately 2014-50 BCE. During this peak period, which archaeologists call the Neopalatial period after the rebuilding of the major palaces following an earthquake around 1700 BCE, the Minoan civilization produced the palace complexes of Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, a tradition of painted plaster fresco of extraordinary quality, a maritime trade network that connected Crete to Egypt and the Levant and the Aegean Islands, and a writing system that represents the earliest known script in Europe. The specific character of Minoan civilization, its apparent lack of fortifications, the absence of depictions of warfare in its art, the prominence of women in its visual culture, has generated more interpretive debate than almost any aspect of prehistoric European archaeology. What is most striking about the Minoan evidence is not any single feature, but the combination of features that it presents. The architectural complexity of the palaces, the quality of the painted decoration, the sophistication of the administrative system, the geographic reach of the maritime trade network, and the apparent absence of the military apparatus that most other complex societies of the period considered essential. This combination is genuinely unusual, and understanding it is the central challenge of Minoan studies. The absence of depictions of warfare in its art, the prominence of women in its visual culture, and the specific aesthetic of its frescoes and its ceramics has generated more interpretive debate than almost any aspect of prehistoric European archaeology. The Minoans have been proposed as a matriarchal society, a pacifist civilization, a goddess-worshipping culture that stood in contrast to the patriarchal, militaristic civilizations of the surrounding world. Most of these interpretations are now considered to have overreached the evidence, but they reflect a genuine recognition that the Minoan civilization was different in significant ways from the other major civilizations of the second millennium BCE, and that the nature of that difference is worth taking seriously. What is not in doubt is the achievement. The frescoes of Knossos, the architecture of the palaces, the painted ceramics, the carved stone vessels, the gold jewelry. The material culture of the Minoan civilization was of a quality and a sophistication that was not surpassed in Europe for more than 2,000 years after its collapse. The island of Crete is the largest of the Greek islands, stretching for roughly 260 kilometers from east to west across the eastern Mediterranean, and its specific geography shaped the civilization that developed within it. The island is defined by a central mountain spine running east to west, with peaks reaching over 2,400 meters and maintaining snow cover through much of the winter. The specific ecological diversity of Crete, with its range of altitude from sea level to high mountain, its variety of soil types, and its combination of Mediterranean and more continental climatic zones, made it capable of supporting a wide range of agricultural and pastoral activities within a relatively small geographic area. The variety of agricultural produce available within the island, combined with the maritime access to the broader eastern Mediterranean, gave the Minoan economy a flexibility and a range that more geographically limited civilizations could not match. With peaks reaching over 2,400 meters and maintaining snow cover through much of the winter. The mountain range divides the island into a wetter, more fertile northern coast and a drier, more austere southern coast, and the main Minoan palace sites are concentrated on the northern side of the island, where the agricultural lowlands and the protected harbor sites provided the combination of resources that palace civilization required. The Mizara Plain in the south is the largest flat area of the island and was also an important zone of Minoan settlement, with the palace of Phaistos positioned at its northern margin. The sea around Crete was the other defining feature of the Minoan world. Crete sits at the center of an arc of islands and coastlines that spans the eastern Mediterranean, within sailing distance of the Cyclades to the north, the coast of the Levant to the east, the delta of Egypt to the south, and the coasts of mainland Greece and Anatolia in the broader horizon. The Minoans were a maritime people in a deep sense. Their economy depended on sea trade, their culture reflected the sea in its imagery and its aesthetic, and their political relationships with other communities of the ancient Mediterranean world were conducted primarily through the medium of the sea. The specific harbors of the Minoan north coast, including the harbor at Knossos and the better-preserved harbor sites at Zakros on the eastern tip of the island, were the gateways through which the goods of the Minoan trade network moved. Ships from Egypt bringing gold and ivory and lapis lazuli would have anchored in these harbors, while Cretan merchants came aboard to exchange the pottery and the textiles and the timber and the processed agricultural products that Crete exported. The harbor was the point of connection between the island civilization and the wider world, and the movement of goods through the Minoan harbors was one of the most important economic activities of the ancient eastern Mediterranean. The island's mountain sanctuaries, located at the peaks of specific mountains with wide views of the surrounding landscape, were among the most important ritual sites in the Minoan world. The specific combination of height, visibility, and dramatic natural setting that characterized these peak sanctuaries speaks to a religious tradition that understood the mountain peaks as places of special proximity to the divine, and the ritual objects found at these sites, including the terracotta figurines of worshippers and the clay models of body parts offered in healing rituals, document a tradition of religious practice that was both geographically specific and emotionally immediate. The discovery of the Minoan civilization is almost entirely the work of one person, Arthur Evans, and the story of that discovery is inseparable from the personality and the interpretive framework of the man who conducted it. Evans was a wealthy British archaeologist with a specific interest in the pre-Greek past of the Aegean. He had seen Cretan inscribed seal stones in the antiquities markets of Athens in the 1890s and had become convinced that they came from a literate prehistoric civilization on Crete that was older than anything the Greek tradition had preserved. He began acquiring land at the site of Knossos in 1898 and began systematic excavation in March 1900. Within days, the scale of the buried palace was apparent, and within weeks it was clear that Evans had found something that would transform the understanding of ancient European history. The excavation of Knossos proceeded at remarkable speed by modern standards. Within 4 years, Evans had exposed most of the palace complex, recovered thousands of artifacts, identified 2 distinct scripts in the clay tablet archives, and begun the architectural restoration and reconstruction that would make Knossos one of the most controversial archaeological sites in the world. The reconstructions, in which Evans and his architect Theodore Fife used reinforced concrete to rebuild missing architectural elements based on their interpretation of the surviving evidence, have been criticized by subsequent archaeologists for going well beyond what the evidence could support, for imposing Evans's specific vision of the palace on a structure whose original appearance was considerably more uncertain than the reconstructions suggest. Evans also named the civilization, invented its chronology, and produced the dominant interpretation of it that shaped Minoan studies for most of the 20th century. His interpretation, which emphasized the religious prominence of a great goddess and proposed a priestly ruling class centered on the palace as a religious institution, was influential but has been substantially revised in subsequent decades. The specific woman who ruled over the Minoan world in Evans's interpretation, a great queen priestess who mediated between humanity and the goddess, is now considered an overinterpretation of the available evidence, reflecting Evans's own cultural assumptions as much as the archaeological record he was analyzing. The subsequent decades of Minoan archaeology, conducted by Greek, British, American, and international teams at sites across Crete, have produced a much more complex and more carefully grounded picture of the civilization than Evans's rapid early work could provide. The specific contribution of each major excavation to the overall picture has been cumulative rather than sequential. The French excavation of Phaistos revealed a palace with a different spatial logic from Knossos. The Greek excavation of Malea documented a palace with its own specific material culture, and the Greek excavation of Zakros recovered a palace whose exceptional preservation, the result of its burial under a thick layer of debris, gave an unusually complete picture of a Minoan palace in its final state. Together, these 4 palace excavations define the framework within which all subsequent Minoan research is conducted. At sites across Crete, have produced a much more complex and more carefully grounded picture of the civilization than Evans's rapid early work could provide. The other major palace sites, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, were excavated by French, Greek, and Greek teams respectively, and the specific character of each palace, the ways in which they resembled Knossos and the ways in which they differed from it, has added significantly to the understanding of the Minoan political and cultural world. The palaces of Crete are the defining architectural achievement of the Minoan civilization, and their specific character, at once practical and theatrical, functional and elaborately beautiful, makes them unlike any other building type in the ancient world. The Minoan palace was not a palace in the sense of a single large building occupied by a single ruler and their household. It was a complex of buildings organized around a large central court, incorporating storage facilities, administrative spaces, craft workshops, ceremonial halls, domestic apartments, and the elaborate drainage and water management systems that gave the palaces of Crete a standard of plumbing not seen again in Europe until the Roman period. The central court of Knossos is roughly 27 meters wide and 53 meters long, oriented on a roughly north-south axis, and the buildings that surround it on all sides rise to at least 2 stories and in some areas perhaps 4. The west wing of the palace, facing the central court, was the ceremonial heart of the complex. The throne room, which preserves its original stone throne in situ, flanked by painted griffins on the walls, is one of the most remarkable intact interior spaces from the ancient world. The throne is a simple carved stone seat, elegant in its plainness, and the painted griffins that frame it on either side are among the best preserved Minoan frescoes. Whether the throne was used by a human ruler or served some purely ritual function is a question that the evidence does not decisively resolve, but the spatial logic of the room, the throne facing the lustral basin across the central space, speaks to a setting designed for specific ceremonial purposes. The storage magazines that line the western portion of the palace are another striking feature. Large clay storage jars, called pithoi, some standing nearly as tall as a person, are still in their original positions in the long narrow storage rooms that run along the western edge of the complex. The storage capacity of these magazines was enormous, and the administrative tablets found in the palace rooms above them speak to a bureaucratic system for managing the flow of goods into and out of the palace stores that was as sophisticated as any in the ancient Near East. The frescoes are the most celebrated element of the Minoan palaces, and the specific images they preserve give a vivid window into the visual world of the Minoan elite. The bull-leaping fresco, showing acrobatic figures vaulting over the back of a charging bull, is perhaps the most famous single image from the Minoan world. The dolphin fresco, with its blue dolphins swimming above sea creatures against an azure background, is among the most visually immediate of the ancient world's decorative paintings. The processional frescoes showing figures carrying offerings, the landscape paintings with their lilies and wild cats, the figures of women in elaborate flounced skirts. Together these images create a picture of an aristocratic culture of considerable visual sophistication. The economy of the Minoan world was organized around the palace as a redistribution center, and the trade networks that the palaces managed connected Crete to a wide area of the ancient Mediterranean. The administrative tablets found at Knossos and at the other palace sites are written in 2 distinct scripts. The earlier script, called Linear A, has not been deciphered and is presumably written in the Minoan language, whatever that was. The later script, Linear B, was deciphered by the British architect Michael Ventris in 1952 and turned out to be an early form of Greek, demonstrating that the later palace at Knossos was administered by Greek-speaking Mycenaeans rather than by the original Minoan population. The Linear B tablets from Knossos are primarily administrative records, documenting the movement of specific quantities of wool, grain, oil, bronze, and other commodities through the palace redistribution system. The palace redistribution economy worked by concentrating agricultural and craft production from the surrounding countryside in the palace stores and then redistributing it to the palace workforce and to the communities that participated in the palace's exchange network. The specific efficiency of the Minoan palace economy as a commercial system is one of its more impressive features. The standardization of ceramic forms used for specific categories of commodity, the use of the clay seals as a system of authentication and accountability, and the integration of the storage and administrative functions within the same architectural complex all speak to a system that had been refined across generations to manage the flow of goods through a complex network with minimum administrative friction. From the surrounding countryside in the palace stores and then redistributing it to the palace workforce and to the communities that participated in the palace's exchange network. Farmers in the Knossos hinterland delivered grain, oil, wine, and wool to the palace in quantities recorded on the linear B tablets. Craftspeople working in the palace workshops produced textiles, pottery, metalwork, and other goods using the raw materials provided by the palace. The finished goods were then exported through the palace's trade networks in exchange for the imported materials, including copper from Cyprus, tin from elsewhere, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan via Levantine intermediaries, and gold and ivory from Egypt, that gave the Minoan elite material culture its distinctive luxury character. The Minoan maritime trade network was extensive enough to leave material traces at sites across a wide area of the ancient Mediterranean. Minoan pottery and Minoan-style fresco paintings have been found at sites in Egypt, the Levant, mainland Greece, and the Aegean Islands, documenting the geographic reach of Minoan commercial and cultural influence. The frescoes at the site of Tel el-Dab'a in the Egyptian Delta, which show bull leaping and other distinctively Minoan subjects, are among the most dramatic evidence for the direct cultural exchange between Crete and Egypt in the Neopalatial period. The relationship between Crete and the Aegean Islands, and particularly the relationship with the volcanic island of Thera, known today as Santorini, was especially close in the Neopalatial period. The island of Thera supported a flourishing Minoan-influenced community at the town of Akrotiri, which was buried under volcanic ash in one of the most dramatic volcanic eruptions of the ancient world and whose remarkable state of preservation, including frescoes of extraordinary quality, has made it one of the most important archaeological sites in the Aegean. The Minoan frescoes are the most direct and most emotionally immediate evidence for the visual world of the Minoan civilization, and the specific images they preserve speak of a culture with a distinctive aesthetic sensibility. The naturalism of Minoan fresco painting is one of its most striking features. The dolphins in the famous dolphin fresco are depicted with an accuracy of observation that speaks to a culture that lived intimately with the sea. The specific technique of Minoan fresco painting, which involved applying pigment to wet plaster in the true fresco method, gave the colors a permanence and a luminosity that dry fresco techniques could not achieve. The specific mineral pigments used, Egyptian blue, red ochre, yellow ochre, and white lime, were the same materials used by Egyptian and Mycenaean painters, but the Minoan tradition used them in combination and in specific compositional arrangements that gave the Minoan frescoes their characteristic aesthetic identity. The dolphins in the famous dolphin fresco are depicted with an accuracy of observation that speaks to a culture that lived intimately with the sea, that had watched these animals for so long that their specific movement and their specific form had become part of the visual vocabulary available to painters. The flowers and the birds and the wild animals in the landscape frescoes show the same quality of direct observation, not the symbolic or schematic rendering of natural forms that characterizes the art of Egypt and Mesopotamia, but a specific engagement with the specific appearance of specific things. The human figures in the frescoes are more stylized than the natural world figures, following a convention in which men are shown with red-brown skin and women with white skin, both with elaborately dressed hair and fashionable clothing. The women in the Minoan frescoes are particularly striking. They appear in positions of dignity and apparent authority, at the front of processions, in seats of honor at ceremonies, in poses that suggest active participation in public life rather than the domestic seclusion that characterized the representation of women in many contemporary Near Eastern artistic traditions. Whether this visual prominence reflects actual social prominence is debated, but the specific character of the Minoan visual tradition, its consistent inclusion of women in positions of ceremonial significance, is a genuine feature of the evidence. The bull-leaping fresco raises questions that the fresco itself cannot answer. The scene shows a charging bull and three human figures. one grasping the horns, one vaulting over the back, and one on the far side apparently completing the landing. The athleticism required to perform this feat, if it was actually performed rather than being a purely symbolic or mythological image, would have been extraordinary, and the debate about whether the bull leaping scenes represent an actual ritual athletic performance or a purely visual symbol of the relationship between humans and the bull has not been resolved. What is clear is that the bull was a creature of enormous symbolic importance in the Minoan world, appearing in frescoes and in clay models and in the elaborate stone rita or ritual vessels, shaped as bull heads that were used in Minoan ceremonies. The specific palette of Minoan fresco painting, with its characteristic blues, reds, whites, and yellows, was the product of specific mineral pigments applied to wet plaster in the true fresco technique. And the vivid preservation of these colors after more than 3,000 years speaks to the specific atmospheric conditions of the buried palace and to the quality of the materials and the technique used by the original painters. The religious life of the Minoan civilization is documented in the archaeological evidence in ways that speak to a complex and sophisticated tradition, though the specific content of Minoan beliefs remains largely inaccessible without a deciphered text. The peak sanctuaries that occupied the summits of specific mountains across Crete are among the most important sites for understanding Minoan religion. The density of votive offerings found at these sites, including clay figurines of worshippers with raised arms, clay models of animals, and clay models of body parts that were apparently offered in healing rituals, speaks to a tradition of popular religious devotion. The specific selection of mountain peaks as sacred sites was not random. The peaks that served as sanctuaries were typically those with the widest views of the surrounding landscape and the longest approaches, suggesting that the combination of visibility and accessibility was part of what made a specific peak suitable as a sacred site. The worshippers who climbed these peaks were not simply going to a convenient elevated location. They were making a deliberate journey to a specific place that was understood to be in special proximity to the divine powers that governed the natural world. Are among the most important sites for understanding Minoan religion. The density of votive offerings found at these sites, including clay figurines of worshippers with raised arms, clay models of animals, and clay models of body parts that were apparently offered in healing rituals, speaks to a tradition of popular religious devotion that was distinct from the palace cult documented in the administrative texts. The mountain peaks, with their dramatic views and their specific meteorological character, including the storms and lightning that naturally concentrated at high elevations, were understood as the dwelling places of divine powers, and the specific deities associated with them were presumably related to the storm and the fertility that the mountain weather systems influenced. The cave sanctuaries of Crete, particularly the Dictaean Cave and the Idaean Cave, were also major cult sites, and the offerings found within them document a tradition of cave worship that continued from the Minoan period through the Greek period and into the Roman era. The Greek tradition associated the Dictaean Cave with the birth of Zeus, and the continuity of cult activity at these sites across more than 2,000 years is evidence of the deep attachment of the Cretan population to specific sacred places in the landscape. The palace ritual, documented in the visual evidence of the frescoes and the throne room and in the administrative evidence of the tablets, was a distinct tradition from both the peak sanctuary cult and the cave cult. The specific ceremonies that took place in the ceremonial halls and the central courts of the palaces are not directly recoverable from the material evidence, but the architectural provision for specific kinds of ritual activity, the lustral basins that may have served for ritual purification, the pillar crypts associated with specific religious purposes, and the specific spatial arrangements of the throne rooms, all speak to a tradition of palace ritual of considerable complexity. The specific deity or deities at the center of the Minoan religious tradition are one of the more contested questions in Minoan studies. Evans's identification of a single great goddess as the central figure of Minoan religion has been substantially qualified by subsequent research, which has shown that the Minoan visual tradition included multiple divine figures of different character and that the specific hierarchy and the specific identities of the Minoan deities cannot be reconstructed from the available evidence with the confidence that Evans projected. The social organization of the Minoan world is one of the more productively uncertain questions in Aegean archaeology. The palaces, with their administrative archives and their enormous storage capacities, imply a centralized political system capable of organizing production and distribution across a significant territory. The question of how multiple palace centers, each with its own administrative archive and its own territory, coordinated their activities or competed with each other is one that the evidence raises but does not clearly resolve. The Linear B tablets from Knossos document a palace administration that exercised control over a specific territory with specific boundaries, but the relationship of this Knossos territory to the territories of the other palaces in the Neopalatial period is not documented in any surviving text. The spatial distribution of specific pottery styles and specific administrative practices across the Cretan landscape gives some indirect evidence for the boundaries of different palace territories, but the specific political relationships between them remain uncertain. Imply a centralized political system capable of organizing production and distribution across a significant territory. The specific form of that political system, whether it was organized as a single unified state centered on Knossos or as a set of more or less autonomous regional centers, each with its own palace and its own territory, is a question that the evidence does not clearly resolve. The roughly equal scale of the four major palace sites, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, has been taken as evidence for a system of competitive or cooperative regional centers rather than a single dominant capital, though the later period of Minoan history, when Knossos appears to have been the sole functioning palace after the destruction of the other sites, suggests that political unification was at least periodically achieved. The question of gender and authority in the Minoan world is one that the visual evidence raises in interesting ways. The prominence of female figures in the frescoes, and the specific visual language of Minoan art that positions women in positions of ceremonial authority, has been interpreted by some researchers as evidence for genuine female political or religious power, and by others as a feature of a specific artistic convention that need not reflect the actual distribution of social authority. The administrative tablets, which are the most direct evidence for the practical exercise of authority in the Minoan world, are the Linear B tablets from the Mycenaean period of Knossos, and they document a palace administration staffed primarily by male officials. Whether this Mycenaean administrative culture replaced an earlier Minoan one with different gender patterns, or whether it continued an administrative tradition that was always male-dominated, is not determinable from the available evidence. The population of the major palace sites and of Crete more broadly is difficult to estimate from the archaeological evidence, but the scale of the palace storage capacity and the extent of the agricultural hinterland required to fill it suggest that Knossos was the administrative center of a territory supporting a substantial population. The density of settlement across the northern coast of Crete in the Neopalatial period, documented by systematic surface survey, speaks to a well-populated landscape organized around the palace as its primary economic and administrative focus. The relationship between the palace and the non-palace communities of Crete is another area of genuine uncertainty. The administrative tablets document specific quantities of goods moving through the palace redistribution system, but the social relationships that underlay these movements, whether the palace was extracting tribute from subject communities, managing cooperative exchange between communities of roughly equal status, or providing administrative services in return for the goods it received, is not clearly visible in the administrative record. The connections between the Minoans and the wider world of the Eastern Mediterranean place the island civilization within a network of commercial and cultural exchange of remarkable geographic extent. The evidence for Minoan presence or Minoan influence at sites across the Eastern Mediterranean is one of the more remarkable features of the Neopalatial period. Minoan pottery appears in Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Aegean islands in quantities that speak to a commercial network of considerable activity. The specific mechanism through which Minoan cultural influence spread so widely across the Eastern Mediterranean is one of the more interesting questions in the field. Direct trade, diplomatic gift exchange, the physical movement of Minoan craftspeople to foreign courts, and the adoption of Minoan artistic conventions by local craftspeople working for patrons who valued the Minoan aesthetic. All of these mechanisms may have contributed to the diffusion of Minoan influence, and the specific contribution of each mechanism varied probably by time, place, and the specific category of influence being transmitted. Is one of the more remarkable features of the Neopalatial period. Minoan-style frescoes have been found not only at Akrotiri on Thera but at the Egyptian site of Tel el-Dab'a and at Alalak in what is now southern Turkey, suggesting that Minoan artists or Minoan artistic traditions were traveling well beyond the immediate Aegean world. The specific cultural influence implied by these fresco traditions is one of the more intriguing questions in late Bronze Age Mediterranean studies. Were Minoan painters physically present at these distant sites, working for local patrons who valued their specific skills? Or were local artists copying Minoan models that had become fashionable across the eastern Mediterranean world? The Egyptian connection is particularly well documented. The tomb paintings of Egyptian officials from the 18th dynasty period show figures that Egyptologists identify as Keftiu, meaning people of Crete, bringing tribute or trade goods to the Egyptian court. The Keftiu figures are shown carrying distinctively Minoan objects, including the stone vessels and the metal rita that are characteristic of the Minoan luxury goods tradition, and their clothing and their appearance match the Minoan visual tradition well enough to leave little doubt about their identification. The specific economic relationship between Crete and Egypt that these depictions imply, whether it was a tribute relationship or a commercial one or some combination of both, is a matter of ongoing discussion. The relationship between the Minoans and the mainland Greek communities, and particularly the relationship with the Mycenaean civilization that was developing on the Greek mainland in the same period, is one of the more important and actively debated questions in Aegean prehistory. The evidence shows a complex pattern of influence in multiple directions. Mycenaean pottery styles influenced by Minoan ones, Minoan fresco techniques adopted at Mycenaean palace sites, but also Mycenaean administrative practices eventually installed at Knossos itself. The relationship was not one of simple cultural dependency in either direction but of active exchange between two distinct civilizations that were in sustained and intensive contact across the Aegean. The eruption of the volcano on the island of Thera, which occurred at some point between roughly 1650 and 1500 BCE, was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the past 10,000 years, and its relationship to the collapse of the Minoan civilization is one of the more actively debated questions in Aegean archaeology. The eruption destroyed the Minoan-influenced community at Akrotiri on Thera, preserving its buildings and their contents under several meters of volcanic ash and pumice in a state of preservation that has made the site one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The Akrotiri frescoes, which survived the eruption in excellent condition beneath the protective covering of the ash, include some of the finest examples of Minoan-style painting ever recovered. The specific character of the Akrotiri settlement, visible in the size and quality of its houses, the abundance of imported goods, and the sophistication of its fresco program, speaks to a community that was prosperous, well connected to the Minoan trade network, and culturally sophisticated in ways that went well beyond what the island's modest size would suggest. The specific role of Akrotiri in the Minoan trade system, whether as a commercial hub, as a Minoan colonial outpost, or as an independent community that had adopted Minoan cultural practices through sustained contact, is a question that the excavation evidence raises without fully resolving. Beneath the protective covering of the ash include some of the finest examples of Minoan-style painting ever recovered, and the specific scenes they depict, including a famous naval scene showing a fleet of ships moving between island communities and a landscape of flowing rivers and diverse animal life, give a vivid picture of the Aegean world in the late Minoan period. The specific relationship between the Dharan eruption and the events that followed on Crete is more uncertain. The traditional hypothesis, which proposed that the eruption directly caused the collapse of the Minoan civilization through tsunamis that destroyed the harbor communities and a volcanic winter that damaged agriculture, has been substantially revised in light of new dating evidence. The current best estimates for the date of the eruption, derived from radiocarbon dating, ice core records, and tree ring evidence, place it around 1620 to 1600 BCE, significantly earlier than the dates of the major destructions at the Cretan palace sites, which occurred around 1450 BCE. The temporal gap between the eruption and the palace destructions makes a simple causal relationship between the two events difficult to maintain. What the eruption certainly did was destroy a flourishing Minoan-connected community and demonstrate, dramatically, the vulnerability of island life in the volcanically active Aegean. Whether its long-term consequences for Minoan civilization, through trade disruption, psychological impact, or environmental effects that operated over longer timescales than the immediate eruption, contributed to the eventual palace destructions remains a genuine question that the evidence does not definitively answer. The collapse of the Minoan palace civilization, which appears to have occurred around 1450 BCE with the destruction of most of the major palace sites, is the central unsolved problem of Minoan archaeology. Around 1450 BCE, the palaces of Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, and most of the other major Minoan sites were destroyed by fire, apparently within a relatively short period. The palace of Knossos was not destroyed at this time and continued to function, but with a population that was apparently Mycenaean Greek. The specific evidence for fire at the destruction sites is the most dramatic feature of the archaeological record of this period. The burnt layers are thick and extensive, and the debris within them includes the collapsed and burnt remains of upper-floor structures, roofing materials, and contents of rooms that were in active use at the time of the destruction. The suddenness implied by the preservation of goods in their storage and use positions, without evidence of selective removal before the fires, speaks to destructions that were either rapid or unexpected or both. And most of the other major Minoan sites were destroyed by fire, apparently within a relatively short period. The palace of Knossos was not destroyed at this time and continued to function, but with a population that was apparently Mycenaean Greek rather than Minoan. The Linear B tablets that replaced the earlier Linear A administrative tradition at Knossos document a Mycenaean Greek administration operating the palace redistribution system. The palace of Knossos itself was eventually destroyed around 1375 BCE, ending the palace civilization entirely. The specific mechanism of the 1450 BCE destructions is not clearly established. The fires that destroyed the sites are documented in the burnt destruction layers visible in the stratigraphic record, but whether those fires were the result of earthquake, of invasion, of internal revolt, or of some combination of these is not determinable from the material evidence alone. The traditional hypothesis that the destructions were the work of Mycenaean invaders from mainland Greece is consistent with the subsequent Mycenaean occupation of Knossos, but has been questioned by researchers who argue that the pattern of the destructions is more consistent with natural disaster than with military conquest. The genetic evidence from Minoan skeletal remains, analyzed in recent decades, has shown that the Minoan population was not replaced wholesale by incoming Mycenaeans. The genetic profile of the population of Crete in the post-palatial period shows substantial continuity with the Minoan period, suggesting that whatever political and administrative changes accompanied the transition from Minoan to Mycenaean control of Knossos, the underlying population remained largely in place. This finding complicates the narrative of Mycenaean conquest but does not resolve the question of the nature and the cause of the 1450 BCE destructions. The end of the palace civilization at Knossos around 1375 BCE was the definitive conclusion of the Minoan world. The specific circumstances of this final destruction, like those of the earlier destructions, are not clearly documented in the material record. But the consequence was the end of the palace redistribution economy, the end of the palace fresco tradition, the end of Linear A writing, and the replacement of the Minoan cultural tradition by the Mycenaean culture that the Greek world would eventually remember as the background to the Homeric epics. The mystery at the heart of Minoan civilization is the question of what the palaces were for and who they served. The administrative tablets from Knossos give a precise picture of the palace redistribution system in operation. specific quantities of wool from specific regional centers, specific numbers of workers assigned to specific tasks, specific allocations of rations to specific categories of personnel. The system that the tablets document is rational, organized, and efficient, and it speaks to a palace administration that was managing a complex economic system with considerable sophistication. But the tablets do not explain why this system existed, what social relationships and power structures it served, and whether the redistribution of goods through the palace was primarily an economic mechanism or primarily a ritual and political one. The architecture of the palaces, with its combination of storage facilities, administrative spaces, and elaborately decorated ceremonial halls, suggests that the palace was simultaneously a practical economic institution and a place of ceremony, status, and display. The specific balance between these functions, and the specific ways in which they were connected to each other in the life of the palace, is not clearly recoverable from the material evidence alone. The throne room with its painted griffins, the lustral basins and pillar crypts with their apparent ritual functions, and the large storage magazines with their rows of pithoi all coexist within the same architectural complex, speaking to an institution that did not draw the sharp boundary between the sacred and the practical that later European architectural traditions would assume. The question of whether the palace was the residence of a king or queen, the administrative center of a state, the headquarters of a religious institution, or some combination of all three, is one that the evidence raises without clearly resolving. Evans's reconstruction of the palace as the residence of a priest-queen who exercised both religious and political authority is now generally considered an overinterpretation, but the specific form of the Minoan political structure that replaced it in the scholarly consensus is less clearly defined. The closest analogies in the ancient world are with the palace-temple complexes of the ancient Near East, in which religious and administrative functions were integrated rather than separated, but the specific Minoan form of this integration is not fully understood. What the mystery ultimately points to is the more general question of how a complex society can be organized without the specific markers of political hierarchy, the palaces of individual rulers, the royal tombs, the monumental political art, that most other ancient civilizations considered essential expressions of their social order. The Minoan palaces are impressive, but they are not obviously the residences of individual powerful rulers in the way that the Mycenaean palaces, with their megara and their warrior burials, would later be. The possible explanations for the specific character of Minoan civilization, and for its apparent differences from the other major civilizations of the 2nd millennium BCE, are multiple and none of them is fully satisfying. The geographic explanation proposes that Crete's island position, its distance from the major land-based powers of the ancient Near East, and its dependence on maritime trade rather than territorial agriculture gave the Minoan world a specific character that distinguished it from the continental civilizations. A civilization that could not be easily reached or attacked by land-based armies might develop differently from one that needed to defend itself against the persistent threat of invasion, and the absence of defensive walls at the Minoan palaces might reflect a genuine strategic security rather than a naive pacifism. The economic explanation proposes that the specific character of the Minoan palace economy, organized around redistribution and maritime trade rather than the extraction of tribute from conquered peoples, produced a different social dynamic from the militaristic palace economies of the Mycenaean world and the ancient Near East. A civilization that accumulated wealth primarily through commercial exchange rather than through conquest might express its power differently from one that celebrated military achievement as the primary source of elite status. The religious explanation proposes that the Minoan religious tradition, with its emphasis on female divine figures and its apparent connection to the natural world through the mountain sanctuaries and the cave cults, shaped the specific aesthetic and the specific social values of the civilization in ways that distinguished it from the more male-dominated and more militaristic religious traditions of the surrounding world. Whether this religious tradition reflected or produced the specific social structure of the Minoan world, or whether the relationship between religion and social structure ran in both directions simultaneously, is a question that the evidence cannot directly resolve. The most honest assessment is that the Minoan civilization was different from the other major civilizations of its period in ways that are genuinely visible in the evidence, that the specific reasons for these differences are not fully explained by any single interpretive framework, and that the fascination the civilization has exercised on modern scholars and the general public reflects a genuine recognition that it raises fundamental questions about the range of social forms that complex human communities can take. The island geography of Crete was not simply a passive backdrop to the development of this specific social form. It was an active condition that shaped the choices available to the Minoan elite and the specific logic of the palace economy. A civilization that could not easily be reached by land armies did not need to spend its surplus on military infrastructure in the same way as continental civilizations, and the resources that other civilizations invested in walls and weapons could be invested instead in the ceramics and the frescoes and the maritime infrastructure that defined the specific character of the Minoan achievement. The comparison between the Minoans and their most immediate cultural neighbors, the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece, illuminates both the specific character of each civilization and the specific relationship between them. The Mycenaean civilization, which developed on the Greek mainland from roughly 1600 BCE onward, was clearly influenced by Minoan culture in significant ways. The Mycenaean palace frescoes, the Mycenaean pottery tradition, the Mycenaean administrative use of the linear B script derived from the Minoan linear A, all of these speak to an intensive cultural borrowing from Crete. The specific direction of cultural influence between Crete and the mainland in the period before 1450 BCE was not exclusively from Crete to the mainland. The mainland Mycenaean tradition had its own specific character, visible in the warrior burials of the shaft graves and in the specific architectural form of the Megaron throne room, that was not derived from Crete. The relationship between the two cultures was one of active exchange in both directions, with each tradition borrowing specific elements from the other while maintaining its own specific identity, was clearly influenced by Minoan culture in significant ways. The Mycenaean palace frescoes, the Mycenaean pottery tradition, the Mycenaean administrative use of the linear B script derived from the Minoan linear A, all of these speak to an intensive cultural borrowing from Crete that shaped the specific character of the Mycenaean cultural tradition. The shaft graves of Mycenae, which represent the earliest securely dated Mycenaean elite burials, contain objects that show Minoan influence alongside the distinctively Mycenaean warrior culture of elaborate weapons and gold death masks. But the Mycenaean civilization was different from the Minoan in specific ways that matter. The Mycenaean palaces, centered on the Megaron, the large rectangular throne room with its central hearth and its 4 columns, were the residences of warrior kings who celebrated their military achievements in the specific iconography of the shaft grave goods and the later palace frescoes. The Mycenaean world is a world of warriors and weapons, of boars' tusk helmets and bronze swords and lion hunt imagery, in a way that the Minoan world demonstrably is not. The specific relationship between the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds in the period leading up to the 1450 BCE destructions at Crete is one of the more actively debated questions in Aegean prehistory. The traditional narrative of Mycenaean conquest, in which Mycenaean warriors from the mainland defeated the Minoans and took over their palace system, is consistent with the evidence for Mycenaean administration at Knossos after the destructions but is not the only possible interpretation. An alternative narrative proposes that Mycenaean elites were already integrated into the Minoan palace system before the destructions, and that the transition from Minoan to Mycenaean administration at Knossos was more gradual and more complex than the simple conquest narrative suggests. The comparison also highlights the different fates of the two civilizations. The Mycenaean world survived the 1450 BCE Cretan destructions and went on to its own period of peak elaborateness in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE before it too collapsed around 1200 BCE. The Minoan world ended with the destructions of 1450 and the final burning of Knossos around 1375, leaving the Greek cultural tradition to develop from Mycenaean rather than Minoan roots. The Greek myths that preserved the memory of Crete, the stories of Theseus and the Minotaur and the Labyrinth, Our memories of the Minoan world filtered through centuries of Mycenaean and later Greek transformation, and they give only the most oblique and transformed picture of what Minoan civilization actually was. What makes Minoan civilization different from other ancient civilizations is the specific aesthetic and the specific cultural priorities that its material record preserves. The Minoan aesthetic, as expressed in the frescoes, the ceramics, the carved stone vessels, and the jewelry, is defined by a characteristic naturalism, by an attention to the specific appearance of the natural world that is unlike any other ancient artistic tradition. The dolphins swim with a specific physical accuracy. The wild cats in the landscape frescoes have a specific weight and a specific alertness that speaks to careful observation of real animals. The flowers in the fresco landscapes are specific flowers, recognizable as particular species rather than generic floral forms. This specificity of observation and representation is a consistent feature of the Minoan artistic tradition across media and across time, and it speaks to a cultural value placed on the precise appearance of the natural world that was not shared by the artistic traditions of Egypt or Mesopotamia. The absence of warfare imagery in the Minoan visual tradition is a genuine feature of the evidence. In a world in which the royal tombs of Mycenae were filled with gold-hilted swords and boar's tusk helmets, in which the palace frescoes of the Mycenaean world celebrated lion hunts and military processions, and in which the art of Egypt and Mesopotamia regularly commemorated the military achievements of rulers, the Minoan visual tradition is remarkable for what it does not show. The bull-leaping scenes, the processional frescoes, the landscapes, and the marine imagery. None of these contain the weapons, the battles, or the captive enemies that are so prominent in the contemporary visual cultures of the surrounding world. Whether this visual absence reflects a genuine social absence of military values and military organization, or whether it reflects a specific artistic convention that excluded warfare imagery from the specific contexts in which the surviving art was produced, is a question that the evidence does not definitively answer. But the consistency of the absence across the full range of Minoan visual media, across the palaces and the villas and the peak sanctuaries and the burial contexts, makes the convention hypothesis less satisfying than it would be if the absence were more restricted. The Minoan civilization raises, in a particularly vivid form, the question of whether a complex, sophisticated, economically powerful human society can organize itself and sustain itself without the celebration of military power as the primary source of elite status and political authority. The evidence from Minoan Crete suggests that the answer may be yes, at least for a specific period in specific geographic circumstances, and that the specific combination of island security, maritime commerce, and a cultural tradition that valued natural beauty and athletic grace over military conquest was capable of sustaining a remarkable civilization for several centuries. The evidence for everyday life in the Minoan world, beyond the ceremonial spaces of the palaces, gives a picture of a society that was comfortable, aesthetically sophisticated, and economically productive at multiple levels. The town of Akrotiri on Thera, preserved under the volcanic ash of the Great Eruption, is the most complete picture currently available of ordinary Minoan-influenced urban life. The houses of Akrotiri were multi-story buildings, several stories high in some cases, with large windows and balconies that faced the street, ground-floor storage rooms, and upper-floor living spaces decorated with frescoes of remarkable quality. The town had a grid-like street plan and a system of sewage drainage comparable to that of the Cretan palaces. It was, by any standard, a comfortable and well-organized urban environment, and the goods found in the houses, the storage vessels and the cooking equipment and the imported pottery and the personal ornaments, speak to a community with access to a wide range of material goods. The Minoan villa sites that have been identified across the Cretan countryside, large country houses that participated in the palace redistribution system but were located away from the main palace centers, give a picture of elite life outside the palaces. The villas at Hagia Triada near Phaistos, at Tylissos in the Knossos hinterland, and at several other locations show the adoption of palatial architectural features, including frescoes and plaster floors and storage magazines, at a smaller scale that speaks to a class of wealthy landowners who were connected to the palace system but maintained their own centers of production and consumption. The funerary evidence from Minoan Crete shows a population that was buried with care and with specific provisions for the afterlife, including ceramic vessels and personal ornaments and occasionally stone vessels of considerable quality. The Tholos tombs of the Mazara Plain, circular stone-built communal burial chambers used over many generations, speak to a strong sense of community identity across time, with the bones of successive generations accumulated in the same tomb space in a way that maintained the physical connection between the living and the dead community. The specific beliefs about death and afterlife that these burial practices expressed are not recoverable from the material evidence alone, but the care and the continuity of the funerary tradition speak to a community for which the proper treatment of the dead was a matter of genuine cultural importance. The craft production of the Minoan world, beyond the elite luxury goods for which the tradition is most celebrated, included the ordinary ceramics and stone tools and textile production of everyday life, and the evidence from household and workshop contexts across Crete gives a picture of a productive and technically accomplished artisan tradition working at multiple levels of the social hierarchy. The specific character of Minoan domestic architecture, visible at Akrotiri and at the villa sites of Crete, speaks to a population that valued the quality of the built environment at levels well below the palace elite. The attention to drainage, to ventilation, to the quality of plastered surfaces, and to the provision of natural light in the houses of Akrotiri speaks to a community that understood the standards of comfortable urban life that the palaces exemplified and that aspired to achieve those standards at a domestic scale. The Minoan writing systems are among the most tantalizing unsolved problems in Mediterranean prehistory, and the undeciphered Linear A script remains one of the great outstanding challenges in ancient scholarship. Linear A is attested at sites across Crete and at Minoan-influenced sites in the Aegean in the period from roughly 1800 to 1450 BCE. It appears on clay tablets used for administrative records, on clay seals, and on stone libation tables used in ritual contexts. The stone libation tables inscribed with Linear A signs are among the most interesting contexts in which the script appears, because they suggest a use of writing for ritual purposes rather than purely administrative ones. The specific content of the inscriptions on the libation tables, which were used in Minoan religious ceremonies, might include prayers, dedications, or the names of deities, but without decipherment the specific ritual language of the Minoan tradition remains inaccessible. The possibility that the undeciphered Linear A texts include a religious literature of some richness is one of the more tantalizing aspects of the script's continued resistance to interpretation. In the period from roughly 1800 to 1450 BCE, the signs of Linear A are similar enough to those of Linear B that the script is clearly related to its successor, and Linear A can be read phonetically using the sound values established by Ventris's decipherment of Linear B. But when Linear A is read using these sound values, the resulting text is in a language that is not Greek and that is not recognizably related to any other known language. The Minoan language, which is what Linear A apparently records, is therefore an isolate, a language with no known linguistic relatives. This makes its decipherment without a bilingual text effectively impossible, because the statistical methods that have been used to crack other undeciphered scripts require assumptions about the phonological and grammatical structure of the underlying language that cannot be made when the language is completely unknown. The Linear A tablets will almost certainly never be read in the way that the Rosetta Stone made Egyptian hieroglyphics readable, and the specific content of Minoan religious texts, if such texts exist, the names of Minoan deities, the specific narratives of Minoan mythology, remains locked in a script that may never yield its secrets. The Cretan hieroglyphic script, which preceded Linear A in the early Minoan period, is even less well understood. Its signs are more pictographic in character than those of Linear A, and the corpus of texts written in it is smaller and less varied, making any attempt at decipherment even more speculative than the attempts that have been made with Linear A. The relationship between the hieroglyphic script and Linear A, Whether the later script developed from the earlier one or whether both developed independently from a common ancestor is itself a matter of ongoing discussion. The writing of the Minoans is therefore one of the more significant cultural dimensions of the civilization that remains permanently inaccessible, and the specific content of whatever the Minoans wrote about themselves, their gods, their history, and their understanding of the world is among the losses that the collapse of the civilization made permanent. What modern archaeology has learned about the Minoans in the centuries since Evans first began excavating Knossos has substantially revised the picture that his work initially produced. The most significant revision concerns the political structure of the Minoan world. Evans's initial interpretation, in which Knossos was the dominant center of a unified Minoan state, has been replaced by a more complex picture in which multiple palace centers operated in parallel. The application of new scientific methods to the Minoan material, including neutron activation analysis of ceramic fabrics, isotopic analysis of building materials, and LiDAR mapping of the Cretan landscape, has produced evidence for the geographic organization of the Minoan world at a level of detail that was not available to Evans or to the generation of researchers who worked in the decades after him. These technical advances have supported the multi-palace model of Minoan political organization, while also revealing the specific ways in which the different palace territories were economically integrated through exchange networks that moved specific categories of goods between specific production and consumption centers. Evans's initial interpretation, in which Knossos was the dominant center of a unified Minoan state ruled by a priestly monarchy, has been replaced by a more complex picture in which multiple palace centers operated in parallel, each with its own territory and its own administrative system, and in which the relationship between the different centers was probably more competitive and more fluid than Evans's unified state model assumed. The systematic excavation of Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros over the past century has shown that each of these palaces had its own distinct character, its own local ceramic tradition, and its own specific relationship to the surrounding landscape, inconsistent with a system of rigid administrative subordination to Knossos. The dating of the Levant eruption, which Evans and subsequent researchers had placed around 1500 BCE in a position that made it a possible cause of the 1450 BCE palace destructions, has been substantially revised by the accumulation of radiocarbon dates, ice core data, and tree ring records pointing to an eruption around 1620 to 1600 BCE, too early to be a direct cause of the Cretan destructions. This revision required a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between the Levant eruption and the Minoan collapse, and the current understanding treats the two as distinct events separated by more than a century, with the eruption and its environmental consequences having possibly contributed to a period of instability but not directly causing the palace destructions. The genetic analysis of Minoan skeletal remains, published in 2013, resolved a long-standing debate about the geographic origins of the Minoan population. The earlier hypothesis that the Minoans had migrated from Africa was contradicted by the genetic evidence, which showed that the Minoan population was most closely related to the Neolithic farming populations of Anatolia and the Aegean, consistent with the hypothesis that Minoan civilization grew from the same agricultural communities that had spread farming across Europe in the preceding millennia. The ongoing excavations at Minoan sites across Crete and the continuing study of the Akrotiri site on Thera continue to produce new evidence that adds to the understanding of the civilization. Each new fresco, each new administrative tablet, each new analysis of the material culture adds a piece to a picture that is becoming more complete with each generation of research. What remains uncertain about the Minoans is, in some ways, the most important thing about them: the specific content of their inner life, their beliefs, their political culture, and their self-understanding. The undeciphered linear A script is the most fundamental barrier. If linear A were deciphered, the picture of Minoan civilization would be transformed in ways that are difficult to predict, because the specific content of whatever the Minoans wrote about themselves might confirm, revise, or completely overturn the picture that the material evidence has produced. The recent application of machine learning methods to the linear A corpus has produced some interesting preliminary results about the statistical structure of the script, but has not yet produced a breakthrough in the direction of decipherment. The fundamental problem remains the same. Without a bilingual text and without knowledge of the underlying language, the assignment of specific sound values or semantic meanings to specific signs cannot be verified, and the apparent regularities that any analytical method finds in the script could reflect genuine linguistic structure or could be artifacts of the analysis. The progress of the field is real but cautious, and the expectation of a rapid decipherment is not justified by the current state of the research. The administrative tablets would give specific names, specific quantities, specific allocations that would ground the understanding of the palace economy in a detail that is currently missing. The ritual texts, if such texts exist, would give access to the specific beliefs and the specific narratives of the Minoan religious tradition that the material evidence can only gesture at. The cause of the 1450 BCE palace destructions remains genuinely uncertain. The material evidence documents the fires but does not explain them, and the competing hypotheses of Mycenaean invasion, internal revolt, natural disaster, and complex multi-causal disruption all have some evidence in their favor, and none has sufficient evidence to be considered established. The transition from Minoan to Mycenaean administration at Knossos, visible in the shift from linear A to linear B in the administrative archive, is the clearest evidence for some kind of political change, but the specific mechanism and the specific timing of that change are not clearly recoverable. The social position of women in the Minoan world, which the visual evidence raises so insistently, is not directly determinable from the available material record. The prominent position of female figures in the frescoes and in the figurine tradition speaks to a visual culture that valued female presence and female ceremony in ways that the contemporary Near Eastern artistic traditions did not, but whether this visual convention reflected actual social reality is the fundamental interpretive question, and it is one that the evidence addresses only obliquely. The specific mechanisms that allowed the Minoan palace economy to sustain itself for several centuries without the prominent military apparatus that characterized the other major palace economies of the second millennium BCE is another question that the evidence suggests but does not answer. The geographic security of an island civilization, the specific character of the maritime trade economy, and the specific religious and social traditions of Minoan culture may all have contributed, but the specific combination that made the Minoan experiment work for as long as it did is not yet fully understood. The Minoan civilization changes how we think about the range of social forms available to complex ancient societies, and about the specific conditions that can produce a culture oriented toward beauty and natural observation rather than toward military power. The most immediate implication is aesthetic. The Minoan tradition is evidence that a complex, economically powerful ancient society can develop and sustain a visual tradition of remarkable naturalism and of genuine beauty without the specific narrative of power and conquest that dominates the art of most contemporary civilizations. The dolphins of Knossos, the landscape frescoes of Akrotiri, the painted stone vessels of the palace workshops. These are not merely decorative. They are the expression of a specific set of cultural values, a specific orientation toward the natural world and toward the human body and toward the pleasures of vision that distinguished the Minoan world from its contemporaries. The broader implication is political. The Minoan evidence suggests that a complex society organized around a palace redistribution economy and maritime trade can sustain itself without celebrating military achievement as the primary source of elite status. The absence of warfare imagery in the Minoan visual tradition, and the absence of fortifications at the major palace sites, speak to a civilization that either did not face the same military pressures as its contemporaries or that managed those pressures through mechanisms that did not require the celebration of military power in its visual culture. Which of these explanations is correct, and whether they can be separated, is one of the more intellectually productive questions that the Minoan evidence raises. The connection between the Minoan civilization and the later Greek tradition is one that the material evidence documents and that the mythological tradition preserves in transformed form. The Greek myths of Crete, the stories of Theseus and the Minotaur and Daedalus and the Labyrinth, are memories of the Minoan world so thoroughly transformed by centuries of retelling that they bear little direct relationship to the historical civilization they preserve. But they are memories nonetheless, and the persistence of the memory of Crete as a place of power, of mystery, and of something different from the mainland Greek world, across the centuries of transformation that separate the mythological tradition from the historical civilization, speaks to the impression that the Minoan world made on the later cultures that encountered its ruins. The Minoans built something genuinely remarkable in the eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd millennium BCE. They built it in a way that we are still trying to understand, from evidence that speaks eloquently about what they valued and ambiguously about how they organized themselves. And the questions their civilization raises about the range of human social possibility have not yet found their final answers. The people of the Minoan world were fully human, and the evidence they left behind connects them to the present in the specific way that great art always connects its makers to those who encounter it. The painter who applied the dolphin fresco to the wall of the Queen's Megaron at Knossos was working in a tradition of craft knowledge that had been accumulated across many generations, using techniques and materials that had been developed and refined over centuries. But the specific image, the specific curve of the dolphin's body and the specific blue of the water and the specific arrangement of the marine creatures that accompany the dolphins, these are the choices of a specific person, expressing a specific vision of the sea and its inhabitants that has lasted for more than 3,000 years in the preserved plaster of the palace wall. The athletes in the bull-leaping fresco were either performing a specific ritual that the painter observed and recorded, or they were figures in a tradition of symbolic imagery, whose specific meaning the painter was encoding in a visual form that communicated directly to the Minoan audience. Either way, the painter was doing what painters do, making specific choices about how to represent specific things in order to communicate specific meanings to specific viewers. The communication still works 3,500 years later, not because we know what it meant to its original audience, but because the specific visual intelligence of the fresco speaks across the distance. The worshipper who climbed to the peak sanctuary of Petsofa on the eastern part of Crete, carrying a clay figurine that they had made to leave at the site, was doing what people have done in places they understood as sacred across all of human history, bringing a specific material expression of a specific concern or a specific gratitude to a specific place where the boundary between the human world and something beyond it seemed thin. The specific belief that made that climb meaningful, the specific deity or force that the peak was understood to be in contact with, is not recoverable. But the climb, and the figurine, and the act of offering, these are recognizable. The scribes who wrote the Linear A tablets in the palace archive were managing the flow of goods through a complex economic system, recording quantities of wool and allocations of rations and the names of workers assigned to specific tasks. The specific administrative language of their records is unknown to us, locked in the undeciphered script. But the administrative act itself, the attempt to maintain an accurate record of a complex system in order to manage it more effectively, is one that requires no translation to understand. The specific combination of evidence and inference that constitutes our knowledge of the Minoan world is one that requires both humility and engagement. The frescoes speak directly. The tablets are silent. The architecture offers its spatial logic. The absence of warfare imagery raises its question, and the civilization that produced all of this remains, in its most important dimensions, a genuine mystery, large enough to compel sustained attention, specific enough to reward careful analysis, and distant enough in its deepest character to resist the final interpretations that would make it fully known. The central image of the Minoan world is the palace of Knossos in the morning, the light coming across the mountains of Crete and falling on the painted walls of the ceremonial spaces. The reconstructions that Evans built at Knossos are controversial among archaeologists, and the reinforced concrete columns and the reconstructed frescoes that give the site its dramatic visual character are not what the original palace looked like in any detail that can be confidently asserted. but they give something that the unrestored ruins of Phaistos and Malea do not: a sense of the scale and the spatial character of the Minoan palace, of the sequence of courts and corridors and staterooms that constituted the palace experience for those who moved through it, and of the specifically Minoan aesthetic that expressed itself in the specific colors and forms of the frescoed walls. Standing in the throne room of Knossos, in front of the original stone throne and the painted griffins that flank it, it is possible to feel something of the specific spatial intelligence that designed this room. The throne is small, almost intimate in scale, and the room that contains it is not large. But the painted walls and the lustral basin across from the throne create a specific kind of enclosure, a sense of being in a space that was designed for specific purposes that the space itself encodes. Whatever happened in this room, it was something that the room was built to contain and to express. The museum at Heraklion, a short distance from Knossos, holds the greatest concentration of Minoan art anywhere in the world. The original frescoes, the carved stone vessels, the clay tablets with their undeciphered script, the gold jewelry and the bronze figures, the faience snake goddesses with their elaborate headdresses. Looking at these objects, it is possible to understand the civilization that produced them as a genuine aesthetic achievement, a tradition of visual making that expressed a specific vision of the world in specific materials with specific technical skill, and that has maintained its power to communicate across the 3.5 millennia since the civilization that produced it ceased to exist. The sea around Crete is still there. The mountains are still there. The sites of the peak sanctuaries still look out across the same landscape that the Minoan worshippers looked out across when they climbed to make their offerings. The specific human world that looked at this sea and these mountains and made these images is gone, but the images remain, and in them the civilization is still present in the only sense that past civilizations can ever be present, as evidence, as achievement, as a record of what was possible. The myth of the labyrinth is still told. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur is still part of the cultural vocabulary of the Western world, still recognizable to people who have no specific knowledge of the historical civilization that gave rise to it. The specific content of the myth, the monster at the center of the maze, the hero who kills it and escapes with the help of the princess, is a transformation of something real into something narrative, and the gap between the transformation and the original is 3,500 years wide. But the original is still there, in the ruins of the palace on the hill above Heraklion, waiting to be read by those willing to look at the evidence on its own terms rather than through the lens of the myth. The ongoing research on Minoan civilization spans multiple disciplines and multiple countries, and the picture of the ancient palace world continues to develop with each new season of excavation and each new application of scientific methods. The excavation of the Palace of Zakros, on the eastern tip of Crete, has been one of the most productive investigations of recent decades, producing evidence for the palace's role as a gateway for trade with the eastern Mediterranean and recovering important examples of Minoan luxury goods, including the famous peak sanctuary Raiton, a carved stone vessel in the form of a mountain with tiny human figures visible on its surface. The ongoing investigation of the palace's harbor area is revealing the specific infrastructure through which the eastern trade was conducted. The intensive survey of the Minoan landscape, using a combination of surface survey, geological coring, and LiDAR remote sensing, is producing an increasingly detailed picture of the distribution and character of Minoan settlement outside the major palace sites. The identification of Minoan road systems connecting the palaces to their hinterlands, and of industrial and agricultural installations distributed across the Cretan countryside, is filling in the picture of the Minoan economy at the landscape scale that palace excavation alone could not provide. The study of Minoan skeletal remains using ancient DNA and stable isotope analysis is providing new information about the mobility and the dietary patterns of the Minoan population, and the ongoing analysis of the Acrotiri assemblage on Thera is producing new evidence for the Minoan-influenced culture of the Aegean Islands that will continue to expand the geographic picture of the Minoan world. The decipherment of linear A remains the most sought-after achievement in the field, and new computational approaches to the problem, using statistical methods applied to the full corpus of linear A texts in comparison with known scripts of the region, are being pursued by researchers who recognize that the current state of knowledge is not necessarily the final state. Whether a breakthrough will occur is uncertain, but the effort continues, driven by the recognition that the specific content of Minoan thought, preserved in the undeciphered signs of the clay tablets, is the most significant dimension of the civilization that remains permanently out of reach. The Minoan world left enough evidence to be recognized as a genuine achievement, specific enough to be analyzed with increasing precision, and mysterious enough to continue rewarding the sustained attention of scholars and the general curiosity of anyone who encounters the frescoes and asks who made them. The questions it raises about the relationship between complexity and violence, between beauty and power, between the specific conditions of an island civilization and the specific character of the culture that developed within it, are questions that the evidence invites and that the scholarship is still working to answer. Crete is still surrounded by the same sea that the Minoan ships sailed across 4,000 years ago. The specific quality of the light on the northern coast of Crete in the morning is hard to describe but easy to recognize once encountered. Clear and direct, coming off the water, illuminating the landscape with a brightness that makes colors vivid and surfaces precise. In this light, the restored palace of Knossos looks both ancient and immediate, the painted columns and the reconstructed walls catching the morning sun in ways that give a sense, however approximate and however contested by the archaeologists, of what the palace must have looked like when it was alive and functioning. 4,000 years ago, people walked these corridors. They descended into the lustral basins for whatever purposes the basins served. They pressed clay tablets in the archive rooms, recording the movements of wool and grain through the palace redistribution system. They painted the dolphins on the walls and the lilies in the landscape frescoes and the bulls in the bull-leaping compositions. They climbed to the peak sanctuaries to leave their figurines and their prayers. They loaded ships in the harbors with the pottery and the textiles and the processed goods that the palace system produced, and they watched the ships from Egypt arrive with the gold and the ivory and the lapis that filled the palace stores. The palace burned, eventually. The civilization that built it ended, for reasons that are still being worked out. The myth that the later Greeks told about Crete, the story of the labyrinth and the monster at its center, was a transformed memory of something real, a palace of remarkable complexity, a civilization of genuine sophistication, a culture that valued beauty and observation and ceremony over the celebration of military conquest. The bull in the fresco is still vaulting. The dolphins are still swimming in the blue plaster sea. The throne still faces the lustral basin in the throne room of Knossos, surrounded by its painted griffins, waiting in the morning light for whatever ceremony was performed there when the palace was alive, and the waiting will continue long after the last visitor has gone home. The sea is still there. The mountains are still there. The palace on the hill above Heraklion is still there, reconstructed and controversial and visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year. Giving an approximation of what the original might have felt like that is better than nothing, even if it is not the thing itself. The civilization that built the original is gone, in the specific sense that the specific people who inhabited it and the specific knowledge and the specific beliefs that animated it are no longer present in the world. But the evidence remains, and the evidence speaks, and what it speaks of is worth the sustained effort of trying to hear it. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.